We are slowly shifting from the opening ceremony to the first official speech of the conference through the keynote address to be delivered by Dr. Mordecai Oganda. Dr. Mordecai Oganda is a Kenyan carnivore ecologist and conservation policy scholar. He has been involved in conservation policy and practice for the last 2 decades or so, especially in Kenya, but also in other parts of Africa. His work focuses on human-wildlife conflict mitigation, carnivore conservation, community-based conservation, wildlife policy, wetlands ecology, and conservation education. Dr. Mordecai Oganda holds a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology and a Master of Science and PhD degrees in animal ecology. In the course of his work, Dr. Oganda has also taught at Colorado State University and Michigan State University, focusing particularly on the nexus between conservation and human rights. And I think, because I've also known him personally for quite some time, the accumulation of his work in conservation can be traced in his scholarly work and the most recent publication or book called The Big Conservation Lie. It was published in 2017, which was co-authored with Mr. Johnny Barria. Dr. Mordecai Oganda currently serves as the Director of Conservation Solutions Africa, a natural resource management consultancy firm based in Nanyuki at the slopes of Mount Kenya. Ladies and gentlemen, could we put our hands together to welcome our first keynote speaker, Dr. Mordecai Oganda.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I have looked around and I know where all the exits are, so if my talk causes any consternation, I know where to go. Thank you very much, Professor Kiama, Vice Chancellor, University of Nairobi, the President of IASC, and the organizing committee, especially Dr. Kiteme, who first reached out to invite me to participate in this conference. Now, very rarely am I asked to speak, and I wonder, why on earth did they invite me? This is one of those times, but I think they had an idea of what I might say. So, if we could go to my presentation, please. The IT people. Yes, the commons we want is the theme we have here at IASC 2023. Next slide, please. And the title of my talk is Whose Commons? And this is a deep philosophical question. We have lots of technically qualified people around here, but the philosophies I feel from my experiences where natural resource scientists and natural resource science fails miserably in the world today, exacerbating the crises that are caused by global warming, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Images like this from the IASC feeds and website encapsulate the sort of beauty and complexity of what we are talking about. But we need to think about what is a common, first of all. Next slide, please. And it's a resource shared by the general public. It might be intellectual resource or natural resource, even built-up resources. And the next thing draws on the theme of the conference, the commons we want. Next slide, please. Who are we? We as in the commons we want. If I may put it in Kiswahili, tunataka kama nani? Sisi kama nani? Those of you who understand Kiswahili. And next slide, please. So a lot of the commons we have today are gravely endangered, not just by degradation, climate change, etc., but are threatened by capitalists and their agents, who are us. By us, I mean practitioners, conservation scientists. Because we have this cycle where wealthy oligarchs decide they want to get into conservation as a form of self-actualization and say, I'm going to give $2 billion, and scientists scramble there to write proposals about how we can do exactly what you are dreaming about in your warped childhood dreams and put it in reality on the ground, as long as you give us the money. Next slide, please. There's this, the tragedy of the commons, the so-called tragedy of the commons. It's from Garrett Hardin, published in Nature 1968. Garrett Hardin could not see how human beings can use a resource sustainably together, the way Africans have done for millions of years. And he's basically a white supremacist, if you look at a lot of his writings, etc. But we adopted his theory of this tragedy, much to our detriment to this day, long after he died. Next slide, please. Now we have lots and lots of people, just please roll the slide, lots of wealthy people getting into conservation as self-actualization. Jeff Bezos is special because he actually says after he flew in his rocket, then he saw the Earth from out there, he decided it's precious. Yevgeny Lebedev is another oligarch who's involved in conservation. And we mustn't underestimate the power of these people. Next slide, please. Because that's Lebedev at the COP in Glasgow, basically sharing his vision to the then president of Kenya and a number of cabinet members. So when these people come back to Kenya, small people like Mordecai don't have much say because he's already run his vision past the president and the cabinet and it's been adopted. Next slide, please. Now, we have to look at, this is commonly in conservation science circles where I work, this is called habitat encroachment. And this is use of the commons. This is what Dr. Mukovi just referred to as a food system. That's a food system happening there. Next slide, please. We call that a riding safari. It's the same thing happening in the same place, just different species of domestic animals and different race of people using that commons. But this is a lifestyle system. This is not a food system. The local people in that photo, you can't see them, but they're the ones who groom the horses, they feed the horses, and they make lunch for these guys when they're back from the safari. It's a dependency system. And we as scientists have been constantly pushing this dependency system at the expense of the food system I spoke about earlier. Next slide, please. And this dependency system is not sustainable. That's why it has to be guarded by force of arms and ammunition. I'm sure many of you have seen these people in Kenya. We call them conservancy rangers, and they guard conservancies, which are protected areas protected from their owners. I need you to understand that. Next slide, please. So we have various philosophically flawed schemes that we have launched in this day and age to tackle climate change. I say they're philosophically flawed because they are cause elsewhere, effect elsewhere. And the world isn't like that. These offset schemes are like there's a kid who misbehaves somewhere, but there's a kid somewhere else who gets punished for it. Constantly, more misbehavior, more punishment. More misbehavior, more punishment. What you end up with is a kid suffering in one place and a schizophrenic kid in the other place, a psychopath. And this is what we are creating at a global environmental level. Untrammeled consumption on one end and untrammeled oppression of people on the other end. So dismiss these things. I would have wished that the Prime Cabinet Secretary would have been here, because I was alarmed that with our understanding of how carbon schemes are all skewed scams, that the Kenya government currently has a climate change amendment bill that includes this, wants to include these carbon schemes in legislation. And that's a problem. But philosophically, we here in this company are the ones who have to guide our policymakers through this labyrinth of dishonesty. Next slide, please. If you look at that map, it's from Sightline Institute. It basically shows the top carbon polluters in the world. You see the global north there. South Africa is there in Africa, probably because of their use of coal. But we go to the next slide, please. And if we look at composition of Earth, consumption of Earth's resources, we need 5 Earths if we all consumed at the rate of the United States. We need 3 if we consumed at the rate of the UK, 2 and something if we consumed the rate of China. Niger, typical African countries down at the bottom there. But you find the United States advising African countries on how to manage their environment. There's a problem here. If anyone should advise us, it should be India. But I'm yet to see any Indian coming to advise us on how to manage our environment, which I think they should do. Next slide, please. These are carbon sequestration, distribution of carbon credit schemes and sequestration schemes around the world. Next slide. See, that's Asia. Next slide. But that's North America. Very few in North America, actually, there are very few actual carbon sequestration schemes in North America and Europe. They sequester their carbon in Africa. The only honest part of this scheme is in Asia, where they pollute and sequester in the same place. This is colonialism in a nutshell. And we here are the agents thereof. So we must look at ourselves. I know we have many hundreds of doctorates here, but where's the philosophy? Where's the philosophy? Next slide, please. But the European Parliament recently caught on to the fact that grabbing some land in Africa doesn't clean up the river in Germany or Europe or wherever. So they've abandoned neutrality claims based on offsets exclusively, which is good. But the problem, agreements are still being signed now. This was last month, May 2023. Agreements are still being signed now for carbon sequestration. There are 25-year agreements, 30-year agreements. And I've been privy to some of them here in Kenya. Next slide, please. The EU itself has what they call the Nature Africa Initiative. This was launched in Marseille a couple of years ago at the World Conservation Congress. And those are the landscapes and seascapes that they want to basically take over in Africa. Those are commons. Those landscapes and seascapes are commons. And that's what we are there to lose. I looked through all the documentation. I couldn't find any such scheme for Asia, South America, Australia, or Oceania, or anywhere. It's only about Africa. So this sort of needs to raise our aerials. These are red flags. Next slide, please. Apart from that, we also have the cryptocurrency blockchain thing. We now have dams in Virunga producing electricity to mine Bitcoin. So they're using commons in Africa to somehow gain materially, to actualize material gains that are applied elsewhere or that go elsewhere out of Africa. This is commercial climate resource colonialism. And this is what we must look at philosophically. We know all the technical things. There's very little technical stuff left to be discovered about the commons. It's the philosophical questions we need to really deal with now. Next slide, please. how can we actually be useful to the commons? Because most of us are detrimental to the commons now. And I'm talking about us scientists and practitioners. We are what in Kiswahili is called vibaraka. These are sort of, vibaraka in English translates to sort of paid right-hand men or court jesters who serve nefarious interests. We have to develop new standards and definitions. We have to use indigenous knowledge. So we can't take everything from what's been published in Nature and try and bring it to apply it in Nyanza somewhere. We have to entrench indigenous livelihoods and aspirations in this discourse, partnering with the humanities. I cannot overemphasize that. Tourism should be removed from this discourse. Kenya is one of the major victims of this. That's because we've always had this strange cabinet ministry called Tourism and Wildlife. Tourism has nothing to do with wildlife conservation. It's a byproduct. It's like you don't keep livestock for the leather. You keep them for meat and milk. Leather is a byproduct. So we cannot have tourism at the same table with conservation because that means we are doing it for outsiders. What are we doing for ourselves? Tourism should take advantage of what we have done for ourselves if it's good enough. Human population should be removed from the commons discourse because it's not something we can apply any of our skills to. We are not seeking to eliminate human beings or else there's a problem. That human population in the discourse, that comes from the tragedy of the commons, that white supremacist thing. So we should remove that. Human population should be discussed by people in the services like education, healthcare services, and these kind of things. That's how we'll move forward. That's why in countries like China, they have the endangered giant panda. You never hear that the 1.5 billion people are endangering the panda. But you always hear that there are too many people in Maasai land, they're endangering elephants, they're endangering lions, they're endangering this, that, the other. It has a racist ideology at its basis. Next slide, please. To protect the commons, we must protect people, systems, and livelihoods. Then the commons will be all right. We do not achieve this by protecting geographical areas. That's a primitive idea that came from Roosevelt, a megalomaniac who knew nothing about ecology. We cannot be saying we need to expand protected areas. The 30 by 30 UN scheme, for example. Went to New York, I didn't see any plans to expand Central Park in Manhattan by 30%. I didn't see any plan to expand Regent's Park in London by 30%, but they want to expand Mount Kenya National Park near where I live. They want to expand Tsavo, Masai Mara, Amboseli, because we need more room for wildlife. So we have to look at the prejudice that lies inherently in a lot of these things. Next slide, please. The science, and I'm a scientist, do not blindly trust the science. Understand and apply the science. This is very important because scientists, just like everyone else, can be dishonest. They lie, they massage data. I'm sure many of us in our statistics classes have heard of it. We remove outliers. This is common practice. So we must understand and apply the science appropriate. Next slide, please. This is an example. A paper published in Nature said the world has 422 trees for every person. And they did that little graphic to show what's the sort of leading countries. So top, Canada, second, Greenland, third, Australia, fourth, United States. These are all settler colonies. The top African country is Ethiopia. Why isn't Gabon there? Gabon would be number one. Why isn't DRC there? Because it would be number one. It might imply that black people know how to conserve forests. And we can't have that, can we? These are the questions we must ask even as we read scientific literature, because there are lies and prejudices therein. These are not Bibles or Qurans or Gita. These are written by real people. Next slide, please. We've recently had an attack on African food systems, pastoralist food systems, by saying livestock is a source of global warming and methane emissions. And we want to remove this and bring tourism. So somehow the carbon footprint of a tourist who flies 10,000 miles and drives in an SUV and stays in an air-conditioned room drinking chilled champagne, his carbon footprint or her carbon footprint is lower than that of that guy with his 50 cows or goats. These are the tales we are being told by scientists and in scientific publications. Next slide, please. The global commons is a poisoned philosophy because commons, especially I'm talking about natural resource commons, they're locally defined. They're named locally. They're named whatever stream, whatever forest. They cannot be defined globally. So we must find a finer context at higher resolution to approach the management of the commons. It is imperative that we do that. It is complicated. Scientists will tell you, yes, that is why we have PhDs. We should be able to do complicated things. I see people with PhDs in the field of wildlife conservation coming up with the idea that we should fence Mount Kenya forest, and it's happening. Yet the same people were laughing at former US president when we wanted to fence between US and Mexico. Why are you laughing at Mr. Trump? And we are fencing Mount Kenya forest. We must necessarily seek more sophisticated solutions to the complex problems that we have in the world today. Next slide, please. Now, the global approach to the commons, and this is always a difficult conversation, is the reason why we have conservation heroes. And I've shared a few of the conservation heroes from Africa. None of them are black. You have Jane Goodall, the late Richard Leakey, late Daphne Sheldrake, late George Adamson, Joy Adamson, Diane Fossey, Bernard and Michael Jemek, Mervyn Cowie. Why is this to this day? They're more contemporary ones. They're still all white. Why is this? Because we've created this poisoned chalice called the global commons, where someone from somewhere feels he needs to go somewhere else to save something else. That is the danger of the narrative of the global commons. And these are philosophical questions. And there are things that I've battled with in my several years in wildlife conservation. And now I've realized that these are the problems that we can solve a lot faster and a lot more easily than we can solve the climate change, emissions, etc. We can change our philosophy right now, next week, and make things different. And this is what I'm examining and what I'm sort of calling on us to think about doing. Next slide, please. Here in Nairobi, we've had challenges to our commons from corporate interests. The Aga Khan Foundation some years ago wanted to take over City Park. Fence it, you pay at the gate, then inside there they do what they call improvements to international standards, and then it becomes a wonderful place. And suddenly the people from Mathare who depend on this green space to come and relax during holidays, who can't go up country, have to pay to get in there. But thankfully, it was questioned by the state authorities, and they put an end to it anyway. But this is the importance of statutory authorities. And in Kenya, the statutory authorities that govern natural resources have been becoming weaker and weaker and weaker with the onslaught of the NGO onslaught and foreign capitalist funding onslaught. And I mean KWS. I wish there was someone here from KWS. It's become a shell of its former self. KFS, Kenya Forest Service. KWS is Kenya Wildlife Service. They've become a shell of their former selves. If the money for carbon sequestration was real, KFS should be the richest organization in Kenya. But it still begs for money from Exchequer. Foreign interests give money for wildlife law enforcement, but they don't give it to KWS. They give it to those cowboys I pictured in the slide earlier on. Law enforcement is not even a devolved function in Kenya, not even devolved to the counties. How did we get to a point that NGOs are doing it? When did civil society become armed? It's only in this country. I'm yet to find it in other African countries, but I'm yet to find it outside Africa. We must think about these kind of things. Next slide, please. Nairobi Water Fund. This is a big name. The power behind this is the Nature Conservancy, corporate interests. And it's the Nairobi Water Fund. It's the water used in this city. They're building tunnels, etc., and dams. You have dams like in Ndakaini, for example, that it's water and it's fenced. The people of Ndakaini can't fetch water there. It's channeled to Nairobi through this infrastructure created around these corporate interests. This has happened in Cape Town as well, in South Africa, and various other places, cities that have seen water stress. And water, once water gets privatized, you are in trouble. Little else matters when you talk of the health, sanitation, etc., around water. So this is why we must think carefully about what we are doing. We must advise policymakers, statutory organizations, governments, wherever we come from or even wherever we work. We must frankly advise governments. Civil society is limited in what it can do to change the lives of people. And there's always the interest of the guy funding you, who might just be some billionaire with childhood dreams. Some of them are even billionaires who inherited their wealth, never worked a day in his life. And you, with your PhD, want to actualize his little playground. And these are the things we have to think about. Kenya is very vulnerable at this point to this kind of thing. And I'm sure many of you who take tours will see the problems that we face around here. But the commons survive because of the people. They don't survive because you fenced it. They don't survive because you got funding from some place far away to come and get people to pay for it. Payment for ecosystem services is a term that scientists have bandied around for some years, and it's philosophically flawed. But we say it like it is something proper, and that's the problem. So the commons will persist, and the commons does persist. Our duty here is to strengthen the commons. Find the commons, learn from the commons wherever you are, and strengthen the commons. Even the recent pandemic showed us the risk we are at. We got to a point where governments, including ours in Kenya, were taking advice from software developers about health. Bill Gates was giving health advice. He was advising on everything except software, which is the one thing he knows. But this is the danger we lie. This is the danger that faces us. We think wealth equals authority on whatever field. And it is very hard. You have to deliberately resist this line of thought. Jeff Bezos with his billions will come and tell you, this is how to grow beans. And you say, wow, he doesn't know how to grow beans. He's just wealthy. This is what we have to think about. So the commons will persist. And it's not all doom and gloom, because the resilience of the commons, the resilience of the people translates to the resilience of the commons. Next slide, please. I'd just like to share some. That's from Laikipia. That's a giraffe that used to hang around with people in northern Laikipia. And it died when they captured it and tried to translocate it into a fenced area. They said these people will kill the giraffe. That giraffe died. Next slide, please. That's Bazule in Burkina Faso. It's a village where the crocodiles are their totem. They feed them, they scrub them and play around with them and all that kind of thing. You can imagine a scientist would come here and fence this, make it a crocodile conservancy, tell that kid to keep out, he needs to pay if he wants to pet the crocodile, and that kind of thing. And he'll say, we are saving the crocodiles from these people, we are saving these children from the crocodiles. Next slide, please. That's Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. These are shared commons, but National Geographic, Discovery Channel, all those will never show you this, because Africans are not supposed to be able to live peacefully with wildlife. That doesn't sell. Next slide, please. That's Talek near Masai Mara. There's an eland that hangs around there, but all the movies you see from Masai Mara don't have any people in them. But this is the reality. They can live with these animals. Next slide, please. This is actually a video. It's from a place called Kazinga in Uganda. Can you click on it, please, if it will? Yeah. So you can see there's buffaloes hanging around, elephants hanging around, kids playing, guys going to their boats, and that kind of thing. But this doesn't sell, so you won't see this. This is from Paul Kirui, a friend of mine who's a tour guide. You won't see this because this doesn't sell. These guys are meant to be poachers, or those buffaloes are meant to be killing their children and this kind of thing. So I hope those of you who are visitors, as you go around, you will see commons and appreciate commons for what they are. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. That's my family enjoying the commons that is Laikipia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Monica Luganda. Ladies and gentlemen, I only have one question. What do you think? The protocol team, please, can I have 3 mics? I need to have 1 and 2 in the plenary. Monica, please remain around. You talk to these people, those who may have questions. We're going to give 5, maybe 10 minutes for questions and responses. From Mordecai or any other person, you may have noted something that you may want to raise, those who have spoken earlier on. Questions, observations, additionals, variations also allowed? All right.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for your wonderful presentation and very valuable facts you shared with us. I don't have a question. I just, not say critic, maybe a request. I'm from Asia, West Asia. I'm Iranian. I just want to ask you, please don't leave us alone and don't leave us behind, because, yeah, we don't have these kind of problems. They're similar that you have in Africa, but we have the same situation regarding protected areas and other, let's say, Western constructed. In fact, that comes to our countries and force many our communities and nomadic pastoralists to leave their territories, leave their commons, because the fortress conservation discourses spread all around the countries in West Asia, in Central Asia. You see, in Asia, we more or less have the same situation. We have a constructed contradiction between communities and wildlife who have been living together and learn from each other for thousands of years, and then in less than 70 years, it seems breaks that, okay, they are just some poachers, they are hunters, they're killing wildlife, and some graduated students without any kind of knowledge, some urban guys have more knowledge than some elder there, and they need to be there, they need to guard, and they need to place some fences around some locations and force communities to live there and territories for so-called protection of nature. So in Asia, in all that space, we have the same situation. So please don't leave us behind. Thank you.
I have a question. Thanks for your talk. Actually, you mentioned in the beginning to keep the tourism perspective out of thinking about governance. I'm wondering from the European perspective, whenever we try to disentangle agricultural and environmental policy, even in two different ministries, it's quite a mess, and it's much better if these competing interests are merged together so that they can discuss and find solutions. Maybe you can explain a little bit more what you thought about that.
Yeah, about the tourism perspective, I'd say from Kenya, they can come to the table, but after we have finished deciding what we want to conserve and why. So if we can conserve the rangelands in Samburu and work out a way for people to use it together with the elephants and the cattle and the livestock, etc., then the tourists can come and see that wonderful cycle we have. Because right now we have tourists who come to Kenya based on what they see on Discovery Channel. And then he goes to Samburu and he says, my God, I saw so many goats and camels and stuff, and I feel like, if you don't want to see Samburu people, don't come to Samburu. So no tourist goes to China and says, I saw too many Chinese people. No tourist goes to Kenya, to India and says, I saw too many Indians. And this kind of thing. So that's a problem. Our tourism sector builds up this magical Kenya thing. It's not magical. Kenya is real and beautiful. It's not magical. Magical is something for children. So we have to counter that power that comes from mass media, Hollywood, The Lion King, Tarzan. That stuff all bleeds into tourism. And if you bring them to the table, reality gets further and further away from your reach.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Michael from Nigeria. Yeah, I do really appreciated your presentation, which was excellent indeed. And we also in Nigeria, we face similar situations whereby the cattle herdsmen go around in respect of their grazing, looking for food, for water. Their belief system is that they should go and do that. But now they are causing a lot of harms, whereby the clashes between the farmers' herdsmen and will cause a lot of problems. So to what he said now, the government is now finding it difficult on changing their mentalities to introduce a series of policies, but they are still agile on doing the what they have to do. So my own question is that how can common change their mentality in respect of what happened in the future to change to the system so that there won't be any clashes? Is there any policy that the government can do, or what can we take home from that? Because you may have a belief system, a norm system that this is what you have been doing for a long time, but because of development have happened, you want to introduce another policy, but they are still kicking against those policies. So I want you to throw more light on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. That's a very important question, especially around pastoralism and pastoralist food systems, production systems. I think as we move forward, we should not be trying to fracture those systems, because what we are doing now, at least in Kenya, we are busy trying to fracture those systems. We should be strengthening them, and by designating proper livestock movement corridors, marked, labeled, protected, improving the breeds of livestock, so hopefully the guy can have the same monetary value in 500 high-quality animals than 5,000 low-quality animals. So things like veterinary care, etc., for these animals, and fair trade markets for the animals and the animal produce. So these are the things we can do. We should not try to fracture these production systems. A short while ago in Laikipia County in Kenya, which is a pastoralist area, they are trying to introduce feedlots similar to what they have in Chicago. Some guys went to Chicago for benchmarking and came back and said, we want to do feedlots. And I wondered, you'll feed cows on maize in Kenya? And what's the price of maize? But it's to fracture the movement. But the movement, because those wildlife also uses those livestock corridors, and that keeps the ecosystem going. In a place like the Sahel or semi-arid areas like northern Kenya, sedentarization is not an option. And what these guys have been doing for thousands of years is what is sustainable. So we should not introduce standards of sustainability which are exotic to the place. Thank you.
Can we have two from that side? The first one at the lowest there and at the back there. And then shall we ask those online with questions to post them so that our team can read them out? Please.
Good morning to the audience, and thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Muniba Isaacs, and I come from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you very much for, very insightful, thought-provoking presentation you made. But I wanted to ask, is it just about philosophy that we need to, is it just the philosophical questions that we need to ask to scholarship on the continent? Because I feel that we are also lacking in critical scholarship to really interrogate these interventions and issues on the continent by black scholars leading the debate, equivalent to, someone like Professor Issa Shivji, that is constantly raising the critical questions. We seem to have lost that critical thinking and scholarships of what our leaders of the 1960s wanted for the vision of the Africa we want. Thank you.
Maybe the next one.
Yes. The next one, and then you will respond to the two, please.
Habari za asubuhi. I really want to thank you for this really interesting talk, but sadly, the question is not to you. I was very interested right at the start. The organisers asked us how many of us work on commons, how many of us are disciples of Ellen Ostrom. We haven't yet asked the question of how many of us are commoners ourselves who work and ought to defend the natural resources that belong to us. And I think that's a crucial question, because it's true when Eleanor Ostrom and so on and so forth were working on commons, very few of the people she worked with were academics. And now today I know that there are people who are now commoners and who would have two hats on, one as an academic, but also as a commoner trying to defend their own commons.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. The first one on critical studies, I think it's crucial, and I'm not sure, probably there are education experts in this room who might know better how to actualize it, but we need to have that critical analysis right across all fields. We even have things like buildings that you don't understand. Why did they design it like that? It seems like a theoretical thing, and now we have to find our way around it. And I think it's very important, especially because that critical analysis brings in local context. That's why globalization of the global commons is a symptom of this failure to think critically. So like at CITES meetings, you have a Kenyan conservation scientist sitting very busy giving his opinions about polar bears. It's none of his business. Let the guys from Norway talk about polar bears. The guys from Norway should not be talking about leopards. It's none of their business. But we've contrived this global village thing that basically doesn't work, and that's why a lot of what we are doing is unsustainable. The one about commoners and disciples of Ellen Ostrom, it's a very interesting question, and I think it's a state of mind, sort of, because everything I say and think is not because of my education. It's in spite of my education. Everything I've been taught is against what I just told you. My supervisors are not here anyway. So, but we've contrived to create these boxes that actually stifle the thinking, the human part of the thinking. And I think it's a challenge to institutions of, not just of higher learning, but right from primary school, that we keep cutting off these branches of growth of ideas from people, and it becomes very violent. And I know in my personal experience, I've suffered for it. So wherever you are, please don't give up. Keep that spirit up.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just about to do something that many would not like, that we have to move to the next session in the interest of time. I want to encourage each and every one of us to look for that person you think has something that you would like to pick up with them during tea break, during lunch break, in the evenings, throughout the week. Complete the discourse. One last clap for Mordecai Loganda. Thank you so much, Mordecai. May I, at this moment, request that all the delegates remain upstanding as our guests in the front bench are walked back to the VIP room, and the others quickly get a cup of tea because the first panels are starting at 11. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful opening session.